Thank you all for coming to attend the lecture of one of our two Manoogian postdoctoral fellows, Dr. Anoush Suni. Dr. Suni comes to us from the University of California, Los Angeles, where she completed her PhD in anthropology this last summer. And her impressive resume testifies to her being an itinerant scholar. Already as an undergraduate, she enrolled in summer programs in Cairo and Sana'a to learn not only Arabic, but also to conduct research for her senior thesis at Ponoma College. After graduating with degrees in Middle Eastern Studies and Women's Studies, she received the Thomas J. Watson Fellowship from the Watson Foundation. That's a fellowship that's geared at recent graduates and fosters a number of projects around the world, and it's very competitive. And her fellowship was sponsoring her travels to Armenia, Jordan, and Turkey. And the purpose of this journey was to study folk music across these geographies. Her study of music, however, was not in the abstract. Already an accomplished violinist, she decided to study the oud with local master musicians. A little Google search revealed that her experience was televised across the Arab world. And I was tempted to show the clip from the Middle East Broadcasting Center, which streamed a feature about a young American woman who chose to learn this very difficult and very beautiful instrument, and without fear performed in front of large audiences. And you can see that on that video, playing and singing in Arabic. After this experience, going home seemed far from her mind, and instead she settled in Turkey, at least for a little while, where she completed her master's degree at Sabancı University. And I think it was here in Istanbul where this spark for her dissertation topic, or at very least the research focus on the relations of Kurdish communities to remnants and ruins of Armenian culture in Anatolia, was ignited. After joining the graduate student cohort at UCLA, she received a prestigious award from the SSRC to do research in Turkey. And her dissertation, Palimpsests of Violence, Ruination, and the Politics of Memory in Anatolia, in true anthropological fashion, is based on deep emergence and participant observation over 2 years, and is the basis, of course, for tonight's talk. The title of this evening's presentation is Palimpsests of Ruins Between Armenian and Kurdish Histories in Anatolia, and we just had a little conversation about this. The word palimpsests just before you all entered the room, and I want to take a moment to reflect on this very word. It is a term that has defined, framed, and driven Dr. Suni's work, and I would say beautifully so. The word itself derives from the ancient Greek palimpsestos, which is a compound word that really literally means scraped clean and ready to be used again. It is a term that initially emerged, we might imagine, from the utility and practicalities related to material resources. Indeed, we may think of it as an ancient form of recycling. For example, it was the practice of ancient Greeks to write on wax-coated tablets. The wax would easily be smoothed over when the text was no longer useful, needed, or important, and the tablet used again. The recycling of writing materials like this persisted when people began writing on parchment as well. For instance, it was a common practice among medieval ecclesiastical circles to erase an earlier piece of writing by means of washing or scraping the manuscript to prepare it for a new text. With the caveat here that the process of erasure often was less complete than imagined, as the older text at times was still legible to a curious and inquisitive eye. The work of recovery of the layers of writing, their meaning, and the distinct forms that lingered below the surface, something that modern historians now do with infrared technologies and digital enhancement, has the potential of highlighting simultaneously the aggregate process of knowledge production, whereas one text may be built on the previous one, and on the other hand, the practice of erasure. Freud's brief essay, A Note Upon the Mystic Writing Pad, is worth recalling here. A mystic writing pad in Freud's time was a children's toy consisting of a very thin sheet of clear plastic that was covered over a waxen board. And one writes on this, and you've probably seen this as a child. You write on it, and your pen makes a mark in the wax below, and through the plastic shines a line. You lift the plastic, and magically the surface is clear again, yet to be written on one more time. The dark traces disappear, the pad is clean again, and somewhat like a blackboard just wiped off. It's mystic or magical. For Freud, this mystic writing pad represented an admittedly imperfect but illuminating example how the psyche records material. Like the blackboard, the mystic writing pad is indefinitely receptive. One can record an infinite amount of writing and materials on it while having always the potential for a new recording surface. But wiping the blackboard is a complete erasure. Writing on a mystic writing pad is different, as the pen always will leave a faint but perceptible trace on the waxen surface below that sheet of plastic. This trace can be seen if one lifts this sheet of plastic and examine this waxen surface. This, for Freud, is analogous to the way the psychic system, which receives sense impression from the outside world, that then are recorded and slide into layers of consciousness, some into the deep abyss of unconscious memory. When you imagine the process of recording on this mystic writing pad or on our memory, we can say that each layer of writing or memory is altered with every new impression. While some impressions on the wax or on the memory might remain largely intact, some become illegible, others might still be recoverable. Thus, Freud writes, the appearance and disappearing of the writing, in this case, is similar to the flickering up and passing away of consciousness in the process of perception. Dr. Suni has and continues to strip away the sheet that covers the imprints of Armenian and Kurdish memory on the landscape of Anatolia. Some are faint traces, some are deep gashes, but she does so to discover the palimpsests of violence. Her goal is to explore the overlapping histories of a century of state violence against Armenians and Kurds in southeastern Anatolia. She focuses on the material environment, which, like Freud's mystic writing pad, bears the traces of the past. Dr. Suni is able here to show how landscapes of ruins are not simply static reflection, in her words, but rather of a bygone time, but rather dynamic spaces in which understanding of the past, politics in the present, and possible futures are negotiated, imagined, and enacted, end of quote. And that this ruination, erasure, and the layering of memory is an ongoing process in the region became yet again clear in the last few days. The most recent news that Turkey is moving its troops to the southern border for yet another onslaught on the Kurds in the region is a testament to violent continuities and ruptures. Erdogan framing the order as a measure to, quote, prevent the creation of a terror corridor across our southern borders, unquote, is telling. Kurds now are and have been for some time. Armenians then were the internal enemy and the perpetrators of terror, who in the eyes of the Turkish state need to be eliminated. Dr. Suni's work then surely resonates in this particular political moment, and as the violence continues, we might ask, when is it that this magic or mystic writing pad or this Anatolian landscape loses its capacity of infinite receptiveness, or will they ever? And for this, you will hear now from Anoush, and please welcome her.
Thank you so much, Melanie, for that wonderful introduction. You did some amazing detective work into my past, which I wasn't expecting. And I appreciate the historical and etymological background as well. Landscapes of destruction. Oh, should I move this up? Okay. Is that better? Thank you. We have our tech expert. Thank you. Landscapes of destruction and the repeating cycles of violence over the past century were the primary focus of the research that I conducted for my dissertation over 26 months in the province of Van in southeastern Turkey between July 2015 and September 2017. In this project, which is the foundation for my first book manuscript, I analyzed specific spaces in the Van region marked by ruins and the histories of ruination that produced them. The geography of the region of Van in southeastern Turkey is marked by violence, ruination, war, and destruction. Travelers to the area can still see crumbling stone churches dotting the landscape, which are remnants of the destruction wrought by the genocide of 1915, in which the Ottoman government massacred and deported approximately 90% of its Christian Armenian subjects. Alongside the ruined churches left abandoned after 1915 are the burned-out shells of Kurdish villages, testaments to the Turkish army's anti-insurgent policies of the 1990s, in which Turkish soldiers forcibly evacuated thousands of rural Kurdish communities from their homes. The story told by the ruins visible on the landscape today is complicated by the shifting positions of victims and perpetrators over the past century. In 1915, many Muslim Kurds participated in the massacres and deportations of Christian Armenians that were orchestrated by the central government, which, while today in Turkey, the Kurdish minority continues to suffer repression and forced dislocation as a result of state and military policies. As we can see by the developments in the news over the last 3 days and President Erdogan's desire to eliminate the political and military presence of Kurdish groups in northern Syria, Turkey's government often views Kurds, both inside and outside of the borders of Turkey, as a dangerous element that must be neutralized. Recognizing the tragic parallels between their current situation and that of the Armenians of 1915, in recent years, many Kurdish groups, including legal political parties such as the HDP, along with the illegal guerrilla organization, the PKK, the Kurdistan Workers' Party, have apologized for Kurdish participation in the genocide and called on the Turkish government to do the same. With a focus on ruins and ruination, my research traces how layered histories of violence are experienced, remembered, denied, and expressed through the material world by examining the interaction between legacies of conflict, memory, and the material landscape. Recent scholarship, such as the work of Anne Stoller and Gaston Gordillo, has called for a shift away from approaching ruins and the material landscape as static objects, and instead towards focusing on ruination as an inherently political process, and on ruins that have been violently produced as social nodes around which lives are not only destroyed, but also lived and made possible. Building on this shift towards approaching ruins as nodes of social activity and political negotiation rather than as static spaces, as well as on the classic work of Walter Benjamin, who explored the Paris arcades as the ruins of capitalism, I explore the ways that alternative temporalities can be produced by spaces of ruins as they blur the lines between past and present, and how alternative histories can be read through and upon them. I focus thus on the ruined landscapes of Van and its surroundings, not only as inert representations of bygone times or as archives of past experience waiting to be read and interpreted, but as both reflections of and products of histories of violence, as well as vibrant spaces in which lives are lived and stories are told in the present and futures are imagined and sought after. I argue that these are not simply negative spaces representing layers of violence, repositories for evidence of past crimes, or sites of melancholia, but rather that the ways that local people have engaged with these spaces reveal their potential to create new possibilities for alternative understandings of histories and new imaginations for the future. Today, I'm going to share with you one section of this larger project. I conceive of these landscapes as palimpsests of violence. Palimpsests, as Melanie so concisely put it, they originally referred to medieval manuscript pages that were reused for later manuscripts by writing over the original text. In such manuscripts, the earlier text or image was visible underneath and through the later text or image. We can see an example of this from Queen Melke's Gospels from the year 862. And this example of a textual palimpsest is particularly salient for my research because this gospel was given as a gift to the monastery of Varakavank in Van by Queen Melke, the consort of the Armenian Artsuri king of Vaspuragan, Gagik I, who built the famous church of Akhtamar. Both the ruins of the monastery of Varakavank and the now restored church of Akhtamar still stand in contemporary Van and were subjects of my research. In my work, I use the term palimpsest to denote not layers of text, but the layers of material remnants of violence on the landscape, which both sediment one upon the other and become part and parcel of intertwined histories. For example, I examine the material remnants of Varakavank and Akhtamar in relation to the other histories of violence layered upon them, lives lived around them, and the stories told about them in the present. I focus on histories of violence over the past century, beginning with the mass killing, deportation, expropriation, and forced assimilation of the Ottoman Armenian community in the last years of the Ottoman Empire, and continuing to state violence in the present day and in the recent past and the present, with a focus on the ongoing suffering of the Kurdish community at the hands of violent and repressive government policies. Considering these two periods of 1915 and the present, a century apart, as two layers of the palimpsest, I ask how they inform each other. How are these two periods of violence embodied and sedimented in the landscape? How are those material remnants manipulated, reframed, remembered, and forgotten? How are these histories narrated and silenced? And why do Kurds now identify with and sympathize with and apologize for violence against Armenians? Given that Kurds were often the perpetrators of historical violence against Armenians, why do Kurds now talk about Armenians as sisters and brothers and portray life with Armenians in the past as harmonious? Considering these questions, I address the themes of historical memory and cultural heritage by exploring both the material archive of the remnants of histories of violence that persist on the landscape, as well as the oral history narratives that are told about and around them. Anthropologist Yael Navarro has described the term remnants, both broadly and also particularly in the case of the aftermath of the Armenian genocide in Turkey, as, quote, shards accidentally left behind in the aftermath of cataclysmic violence, discarded as rubbish, serendipitously found and valued as memory object or incorporated into the new material order of things by being reconfigured, transfigured, or amalgamated. Before the genocide of 1915, the province of Van was one of the most important centers of Armenian religious and cultural life in the Ottoman Empire, with nearly 300 churches and monasteries and over 400 Armenian villages. Official historical discourse in Turkey on the massacres and deportations of 1915 continues to be based in denial. Denial of the exterminationist violence against the Armenian communities in the last years of the Ottoman Empire, denial of the ongoing destruction of Armenian architectural heritage in the area, and denial of any Armenian claims to the land. The Kurdish community of Turkey has been faced with another set of denialist state policies since the foundation of the Republic of Turkey. Denial of their existence as a separate ethnic group, denial of cultural, political, and language rights, and denial of their experiences of state violence in recent decades, including mass arrests, torture, and disappearances. Beyond and in addition to denial, both the Armenian community and the Kurdish community of Anatolia have experienced large-scale destruction and material ruination at the hands of the central government over the past century. For the Armenian community, the massacres of the 1890s, 1909, and the genocide of 1915 loom large in the tragic history of their community. An ongoing process of expropriation, destruction, and erasure of the material legacy of the Armenians of Anatolia has gone on for over a century, including the seizure by the state and military authorities of countless churches, monasteries, homes, and schools, many of them converted into mosques, used as barns or stables for animals, or simply dismantled to be used to build new houses or garden walls. In some areas, such as the Gevash district of Van, locals describe how, in the year 1950, the regional governor ordered all of the nearby Armenian churches to be destroyed so that there would be no material traces of an Armenian claim to the land. This was the fate of the famous medieval monastery of Narek, which was dismantled, and a mosque was built on the site where the monastery once stood. In many parallel ways, the Kurdish community of Turkey has also suffered heavily at the hands of the government. A century of rebellions and repressions, such as the Sheikh Said Rebellion of 1925, large-scale massacres such as the 1938 Dersim massacre, and finally the ongoing war with the PKK, has left the Kurdish community with tens of thousands of casualties and hundreds of thousands more displaced from their homes. In the 1990s, the military employed a policy of evacuating and in many cases burning villages in the southeast of the country as a counterinsurgency tactic. In 2016, the army largely destroyed a dozen cities in the southeast, again producing new layers of ruins on the already scarred landscape. These entangled histories of violence are particularly visible in Van and the surrounding area, which occupy a geography that both Armenians and Kurds claim as an ancestral homeland and where both have suffered and sacrificed. One afternoon, in the spring of 2016, I was walking along a hillside in Van with a local Kurdish friend, who I will call Sami, and his aunt, uncle, and grandmother. This family was originally from Yüksekova, the almost exclusively Kurdish town 3 hours south of Van. They were living in Van temporarily at the time because, along with the rest of the civilian population of Yüksekova, they had been forced to evacuate their homes due to a round-the-clock curfew enacted by the Turkish military. The government had announced the curfew on March 13, 2016, and it continued for 78 days while the army mounted extensive military operations inside the city with the goal of eradicating the resistance being carried out by the Kurdish guerrillas of the PKK and the local militant Kurdish youth who joined the guerrillas in the fight against the Turkish military and police. When this 2-month siege was finally over and the family returned to Yüksekova, they found that their house and the shop that they owned had been burned to the ground and their entire neighborhood reduced to unrecognizable rubble. The 17-member family was forced to find lodging in the cramped quarters of a rented apartment as they attempted to rebuild their lives and livelihood. On this sunny spring day in Van, however, we tried for a moment to forget about the ongoing fight in Yüksekova. Instead, we focused on our current mission, which was to collect wild oregano that grows on the hillsides at that time of year and which would be dried and stored for winter. As we wandered along, looking out over the hills, the uncle turned to me and said, jokingly, "Tell us if you know where the gold is buried." The aunt joined in, saying, "Isn't there gold in the church in our village? I'm sure there's lots of gold there, of course." Skeptical of their claims, Sami asked, "People have been digging for 100 years. Wouldn't all the gold be finished by now?" His aunt replied confidently, "No, it wouldn't all be finished. There's still plenty of gold." Cheerfully, the uncle chimed in, again half jokingly, saying, "Our Armenians were wealthy, and they were thinking of us as well. That's why they left so much gold." In this story, we see many layers of the past century of state violence in southeastern Turkey coming together in a moment on a hillside where memory, landscape, and histories of violence intersect. Here we have a family of Muslim Kurds, themselves newly displaced from their homes, dispossessed from their lands, and made victims of the most recent wave of state violence, imagining their current state of precarity in relation to the Armenian community of a century ago. We hear fantasies of vast amounts of gold buried just below the ground on which we are walking, while many Kurds in the area believe that Armenians buried as they were fleeing the genocidal violence of 1915. Both of these ideas were common themes that I encountered during my fieldwork. Many times, Kurds would draw parallels for me between their experiences of victimhood as targets of state violence and those of the Armenian community in 1915. And fanciful stories of buried Armenian gold and the efforts of hopeful treasure hunters who seek it are endless. However, in this story, the uncle goes beyond a simple parallel of what happened to them is happening to us now, and the more common refrain of, and by the way, before they left, they buried lots of gold. Instead, he is making a more radical suggestion, even if in jest, that the Armenians of a century ago might somehow have known what misfortune would befall their Kurdish neighbors in the future, and thus, in their prescience and generosity, they buried their gold not only for themselves, but for future Kurds in need as well. The uncle here interprets the material landscape as embodying not only a past historical violence, but as evidence of the inevitably repeating cycles of state violence against the peoples and places of southeastern Anatolia, first against Armenians and their homes and places of worship, and now against Kurds and their neighborhoods and cities. Through the ongoing cycles of violence and material destruction that continue to shape the landscape of southeastern Turkey today, one witnesses the intimately intertwined pasts and presents of Kurdish and Armenian communities, and these palimpsests of violence that embody their overlapping histories of displacement, dispossession, and material destruction. Here, I want to introduce the stories of two families and two homes that were caught in these repeating cycles of violence. One Armenian family who lost their home in 1915, and one Kurdish family who lost their home 1 century later. These two stories highlight the intersecting pasts and presents of the Armenian and Kurdish communities and the overlapping histories of state violence in southeastern Turkey that are embodied in layers of ruins on the landscape. In his memoir, called From Van to Detroit, Suren Abrahamian describes his childhood growing up in the Armenian village of Lesk, or Aralesk, just north of the city of Van. Abrahamian was born there to a prosperous family in the year 1907. His father, Abraham, had gone to the United States in the late 1880s, and after working for a decade, he returned around 1900 with a handsome sum of 500 gold pieces. He used this small fortune to build a large 2-story mud brick house for his multi-generational family in his natal village of Lesk. In his memoir, Abrahamian includes a photograph of the village in which the house is visible on the right side, and describes the house as follows, quote, "In 1900, Abraham had a magnificent home built on the very edge of Lesk, with an unobstructed view of the citadel and the city of Van and the magnificent, shimmering Lake Van and its seaport town, Avans. It matched, and by its location, surpassed in beauty any home in the city of Van." End quote. The house was situated in front of the Great Rock of Lesk, a natural rock formation in the middle of the village, which had a small chapel on top. When violence began in 1915, Turkish gendarmes occupied the house, and the family had to move to their grandfather's house in the same village. The family managed to stay in Lesk for some months more before they were forced to flee across the border to Yerevan, which was then part of the Russian Empire. At the outset of the war, Abrahamian's father was tortured by Turkish soldiers and eventually died. But his mother managed to shepherd her son to safety in Yerevan during the first evacuation from Van, along with much of the surviving population of the city. Throughout the war, Van was periodically occupied by the Russian army, during which time many Van Armenians, including the remaining Abrahamians, returned to their home. Each time they had to leave their home, the Abrahamians would seal their house as best they could and hide their cumbersome valuables in the house. They fled and returned multiple times during the war, each time finding that their house had been looted and that their valuables had been stolen. Abraham and his mother survived the war through multiple multiple harrowing flights and stays in refugee camps, and eventually ended up in the United States, where they finally settled in Detroit, Michigan. Suren Abrahamian lived out the rest of his life in Detroit and was an active member of the local Armenian community until he passed away at the age of 101 in 2008. Though they never returned to Van, the family always remembered their home in Lesk. This photograph of the house was cherished by the family, and eventually one of the descendants painted a painting from the photograph. When I visited Armenia in 2017, I met one of the relatives of Abrahamians who had remained in Yerevan. One of the American relatives had given them this painting, and they proudly displayed it on their wall in their dining room as a reminder of the village and the home that their ancestors had been forced to leave behind a century ago. The village today is officially called Kalecik, meaning in Turkish, little castle, referring to the large rock outcropping that still stands in the middle of the village, although there is no trace of the chapel that formerly sat on top of it like a crown. According to a local Kurdish friend who grew up in the village, the chapel had stood until 1950, when the government had it destroyed. On the eastern edge of the village, there is a field, partially bisected by a road, that is populated by gravestones, each one adorned with a weather-worn cross. It is the cemetery of the Lesk Armenians, still standing after a century, although partially disrupted by the road and not immune to the activities of treasure hunters. After reading Abrahamian's memoir, I visited the village and tried to recreate the angle of the historical photograph to see if I could locate the remains of his house. The village now is populated by Kurds from the Bruki tribe, who migrated to Van from the area around Yerevan in the early 1920s, and mostly settled in the then empty, formerly Armenian villages around Van, including Lesk. Today, the village is full of recently built cement houses, though in between the new houses, the crumbling walls of the old mud brick homes that used to populate the village are still visible. In the approximate area of where Abrahamian's house was located in the photograph, I found the remains of a large mud brick house that could possibly be what remains of that two-story home. Only the walls of the first story remain, and inside the walls, the interior is full of grass and other plants. The house had clearly been used and repaired over the years, as in some sections of the walls, the old mud bricks had been replaced with cinder blocks, but it was eventually abandoned and left to fall into disrepair. On the western edge of the village, the Tushba municipality, which was at that time controlled by the ruling AKP, that is the party of Erdogan, had begun to build what was to be a tourist attraction on a scenic hill overlooking the village and the Van Lake. The site was enclosed with a stone wall and had a decorative wrought iron gate, above which were written Tarihi Van Evleri, historical Van houses, and the date 2017. The site contained 3 large replicas of historical Van houses, built as two-story mud brick structures, just like the home described by Abrahamian. In this village, such houses had been built and inhabited by Armenians a century ago, but in this space, there was no mention of that local history. On the contrary, the site was a decidedly Turkish space. Towering above the newly built historical replica houses was a large Turkish flag blowing in the wind, and all of the text was in Turkish. Each house was named after a figure relating to late Ottoman history in Van. The house in the middle was named Cevdet Pasha Evi, Cevdet Pasha House, and the text stated that Cevdet Pasha was the governor of Van who participated in important struggles during the occupation and liberation of Van between the years 1914 to 1918. What is not mentioned is that Cevdet Pasha, with his special troops that had been nicknamed the Butcher Battalion, had carried out the brutal massacres of Armenian villagers in the Van region during those same years. These massacres led the Armenians in the city of Van to barricade themselves in certain neighborhoods and to fight against the ensuing siege by Cevdet Pasha and his troops for nearly 2 months before the Russian army arrived and Ottoman troops retreated. In Lesk, There are multiple layers of violence, erasure, memory, and the rewriting of history on the landscape. It is a historic Armenian village with an Armenian cemetery visible in the middle of the village. Yet there is no attempt to mark or preserve that aspect of the history. The remnants of the one two-story home that existed there is left to crumble unnoticed, while just overlooking the village, the AKP-run municipality built a touristic, decidedly Turkified version of the same type of house. But this time, it's one that celebrates the figure of Cevdet Pasha, who was responsible for the deaths of countless Armenian villagers in Van a century ago. Here, the history and the material legacy of the village has been co-opted. It has been rewritten on the landscape through the house and as a Turkish space, erasing both the Armenians who lived there a century ago, as well as the Kurds who live there now. Three hours south of Van is the majority Kurdish city of Yüksekova, known in Kurdish as Gever, where a local friend, Azad, was born and where most of his family still lives today. Azad's family was originally from a village near Hakkari, the provincial capital, but in 1965, because of a disagreement with the local landlord, they left the village. Together, two brothers and a few other relatives purchased the deeds to another village from a second landlord, high in the mountains just west of Yüksekova. Before 1915, this village was populated by Assyrians who were Nestorian Christians. Like much of the Armenian and Assyrian population of the region, the communities of Nestorians that made up the majority of the Christian population in the region that is now called Yüksekova were destroyed during the violence of the First World War and the genocide. The village had lain uninhabited for 50 years, being only used as summer pastures by the landlord until Azad's grandfather and his relatives purchased the land and moved there with their families. It was a small, mountainous village, and roads became unpassable in the wintertime due to heavy snow. In the 1970s, Azad's grandfather moved with his wife and children to the city center of Yüksekova, where schools were available and his children could receive an education. There he bought a small plot of land and built a mud brick house where his children and grandchildren grew up. Many of Azad's relatives, however, stayed in the mountain village until 1992, when, during the height of the conflict between the Turkish army and the PKK, soldiers forcibly evacuated the village, and Azad's remaining relatives had to abandon their homes and move to Yüksekova. The village was designated as part of a military zone for years and was off limits to civilians until recently. Azad remembers being a young child in his grandfather's house in a residential neighborhood in Yüksekova, where he would play with his uncles and cousins in his grandfather's spacious garden. After some years, the children had grown, gotten married, and had children of their own, and the one-story mud brick house was becoming too small for the family still living in Yüksekova. So in 2010, after the grandfather had passed away, the children decided to tear down the old one-floor house and build in its place a new 4-story building with 8 identical apartments, one for each of 8 brothers. One of the brothers was a master builder and worked in the construction business, and he carefully designed and built the new home that would house his brothers and their families. Over the subsequent years, each family settled into their new apartment, painting it and decorating it as they liked. And finally, the last unmarried brother, Ozan, got married in the summer of 2015 and finally moved into his apartment with his new bride, Dilek, who was also Kurdish and also from Yüksekova. The two were both teachers and had taken out loans to purchase new furniture and appliances to furnish their new house together. Just after Ozan and Dilek's wedding, hostilities began again in earnest in the southeast, along with the disintegration of the peace process and the escalation of fighting. In some cities of the southeast, politicized Kurdish youth, sympathetic with the PKK, along with PKK guerrillas, had begun to dig trenches and build barricades to prevent Turkish police and military from entering their neighborhoods. Beginning in September 2015 and continuing for over a year, the Turkish army declared round-the-clock curfews in Kurdish majority cities in the southeast, in each case mounting all-out attacks on the urban landscape. The stated goal was the ousting of the PKK guerrillas along with the armed youth who had barricaded themselves in certain neighborhoods, but the effect was the massive destruction of urban space and the killing of hundreds of civilians. During these military operations, Turkey's military and police forces killed hundreds of people and forced up to 500,000 to abandon their homes and become internal refugees. One of the first and most devastating curfews took place in Cizre, where for 78 days between December 2015 and March 2016, the city of approximately 100,000 people was sealed off and subject to military operations. Reporters writing about the aftermath of the curfew in Cizre described apocalyptic scenes of destruction. There were widespread reports that over 100 people who had taken shelter from the fighting in the basements of buildings had been prevented from escaping or receiving food or medical treatment by security forces for weeks, and finally had been burned alive when the buildings were deliberately shelled and burned. This massive destruction and the brutal murder of civilians in Cizre terrified Kurdish communities across the southeast, who feared that their town might be next. In the subsequent months after the curfew in Cizre, curfews were declared and intense urban warfare commenced in cities and neighborhoods, one after the next, across the southeast. Parts of Diyarbakir, Cizre, Shirnak, Silopi, Nusaybin, Yüksekova, and elsewhere were largely destroyed during curfews and amid the fighting between Turkish military, the PKK guerrillas, and the affiliated armed youth. The fighting had massively destructive consequences, both in terms of loss of life and the demolition of the urban landscape. By April of 2017, the International Crisis Group estimated that at least 2,271 people had been killed, including 393 civilians, 927 members of security forces, over 1,000 PKK militants, and 219 youths of unknown affiliation. In many places, when residents who had evacuated their homes when curfews were announced returned to their cities after curfews were lifted, they found nothing but rubble. Many homes had been destroyed by shelling and fire, and buildings that had not been destroyed had been ransacked and left in states of filth. Finally, the police and military had written threatening Turkish nationalist, racist, and sexist graffiti on the walls of buildings and homes. The military and police themselves emphasized the connection between Armenian and Kurdish parallel histories during these curfews. For instance, photographs of the destroyed cityscape of Silopi, published by reporters after the lifting of the curfew, show graffiti on the wall of a building that reads Ermeni piçleri, meaning Armenian bastards, along with the signature of the special operations teams of the police and gendarmes. Another example emerged in the early stages of the clashes in Cizre in September 2015, when a cell phone video was shared widely on social media that shows a view of the city of Cizre at night during one of the frequent firefights. Amid the sound of gunshots and shelling, we hear an announcement made by security forces over the loudspeaker to the Kurds in the city, saying, Ermeniler sizinle gurur duyuyor, hepiniz Ermenisiniz, meaning, the Armenians are proud of you, you are all Armenian. These types of statements are not new. State propaganda has for decades sought to delegitimize the Kurdish movement by accusing PKK militants of being Armenian. However, beyond such attempts to paint all Armenian and Kurdish dissidents as one and the same ahistorical enemy, there are indeed significant parallels and points of intersection between the histories of the Kurdish and Armenian communities. In both past and present, these two communities have been ongoing targets of state violence, dispossession, and forced assimilation, most recently in the renewed fighting between 2015 and 2017. In Yüksekova, clashes and fighting between militants and security forces began in August 2015, but months passed before a curfew was announced. When rumors began to circulate that curfews would soon be declared in Yüksekova, civilians began to leave the city, taking with them only what they could carry and leaving their houses and possessions behind. When the curfew was finally announced in March, many civilians had already left, and those who had remained rushed to get out of the city before the entrances and exits were blocked by the Turkish military. The curfew remained in place continuously for over 2 months, ending partially on May 30th, 2016. Ozan and Dilek, the newly married couple that I mentioned earlier, had both stayed in Yüksekova until just before the curfew began, and when it was announced, they took what they could carry and hastily went to Van. There they stayed with relatives until the curfew was lifted. When the couple finally returned to Yüksekova, they found a post-war scene of destruction. The city was hardly recognizable. Where there used to be rows of residential houses and gardens, now there were piles of rubble and debris, destroyed buildings, and the blackened shells of burned-out cars. Their neighborhood was one of the hardest hit, and they found that their house was one of the many that had been deliberately burnt. A few months after the end of the curfew, I met with Ozan and Dilek for tea, and Dilek explained to me how she found her home when she returned after the curfew was lifted, and I quote, "When we returned, we found that our house was one of the ones burned. Of course, they burned our belongings, but that's not so important. But when we came back, we saw that they had written disgusting things on the walls of our house. This is what really hurt us. We know that our house was used by soldiers and police because there was ammunition there. They used the houses and then they purposefully burnt them." End quote. Dilek continues, explaining her understanding of why this violence was wrought on the city and her own reaction upon her return. And I quote, "They destroyed Cizre and Yüksekova on purpose. Many people who left didn't return. They did it specifically to change the makeup of the city, to change the demography. At first, when the curfew was lifted, I didn't go back. My family wouldn't let me go because I was pregnant. They wouldn't even show me photographs of my house. I asked my mother, and she just told me not to think about it. My husband saw them, but he wouldn't say anything. Then I saw the photographs, and I got very upset. Then when I went there and I first entered the neighborhood, my hands and legs became weak and I just started to cry. I couldn't stand it. It's so strange, and we are still paying the installments for our furniture." Here Dilek details the gritty details of the material destruction of space, place, community, and home, and she conjectures that the destruction of space was purposeful in order to change the very landscape of the city. She suggests what many Kurds in the area assert, that the destruction of the cities in the southeast was less about an imminent security threat and more about changing the demography of the southeast. By physically destroying the urban strongholds of the PKK in southeast Turkey, the ruling AKP sought to politically and socially neutralize the influence of the Kurdish movement in the region. And finally, Dilek points out bitterly that she and her husband are still paying for the new furniture that they had bought on credit after their wedding, and which was all burned and destroyed during the curfew. Partway through my meeting with Ozan and Dilek, Dilek's brother, Ismail, arrived and joined our conversation. As we continued to discuss the situation in Yüksekova, both Dilek and her brother emphasized the repeating nature of state violence against minority communities and the landscape. Dilek underlined the way in which many of the people who had suffered from the evacuation and the burning of villages in the 1990s again became internal refugees during this new wave of destruction. She explained thus, quote, "The neighborhoods that were destroyed just now in Yüksekova were all neighborhoods that were built in the 90s because of migration. Now the same people are losing their houses for a second time. The same thing is happening here." End quote. Dilek's brother, Ismail, also highlighted the repeating cycles of violence and conjectured that perhaps the current violence against Kurds was retribution for the past violence against Armenians. And I quote Ismail, "Kurds were made to kill their Armenian neighbors by way of fetvalar, that is, fatwas or religious decrees. Then they were settled in their places. This is what my grandparents would recount. Of course, the official history doesn't say this. Some new settlements were built on top of Armenian cemeteries, and now it is our cemeteries that are being destroyed. You know, sometimes one has to wonder if the reason we have suffered so much persecution is because of this earlier oppression. After all, the Ottomans made the Kurds do their dirty work." end quote. Here, Ismail outlines another common local understanding of the history of the massacres and dispossession of the area's Christian community a century ago, that the Ottoman state made the Kurds do their dirty work, referring to the destruction of Armenian and Assyrian communities. After participating in this violence, Kurds were settled in the now empty villages. The sacred spaces of Armenian churches and cemeteries were appropriated and used as stables or repurposed for building materials. And now, a century later, in parallel fashion, it was the Kurdish communities whose cemeteries were being destroyed, who were being dispossessed of their lands and homes, and who were becoming internal refugees. Considering these layered histories of ruination, Ismail wonders whether Kurds are suffering persecution today as a result of their participation in the unjust destruction of the Armenian community a century ago. His sentiment echoes the commonly expressed idea that Kurds are now paying a price, or are somehow cursed for their part in the massacres of innocent Armenians. The notion that Kurds are carrying a curse for this violence that they inflicted upon Armenians in 1915 was a common refrain expressed to me by multiple people during my fieldwork in Van, and has been documented in other parts of Turkey's Kurdistan as well. Some recounted, for instance, that as Armenians were being deported, they warned their Kurdish neighbors, saying, "We were the breakfast and you will be the lunch," implying that Armenians were the first victims of state violence and that Kurds would be next. In August of 2018, I visited Yüksekova for the first time since my prior visit in 2014, when the peace process was still ongoing and before the war had reignited. During my visit in 2018, 2 years after the curfew had ended, I walked with my friend Azad through the neighborhood where most of his relatives had lived and where his uncles had built the 4-story home. The neighborhood was now unrecognizable. Instead of the cozy streets paved with cobblestones and lined with bustling houses and gardens, there were broad, flattened dirt roads from which dust rose like steam in the dry summer heat. On either side of the road, there were empty fields full of weeds and dry grasses. On a few plots of land, there was new construction underway as new buildings were being built where the old ones had been demolished. There were a few ruins and remnants still left from the fighting, buildings with holes in the walls and windows from shelling and bullets, and the burned out shell of a car here or there. We walked by a plot of land owned by Azad's maternal uncle, which had formerly been the site of a mud brick home where he lived with his large family. Now the house was gone, but the uncle had fenced in the plot with wire and planted a garden inside, which looked like a small green oasis in the middle of a dusty, desolate landscape of destruction. Turning back to the main road, we walked towards the area of the neighborhood where the 4-story family home had been. Nothing remained of it. In its place, next to the road, was a field of dry weeds filled with scattered piles of debris, rocks, and trash. Though the building had been burned deliberately by the soldiers who stayed there, Azad explained, it still had been structurally sound after the conclusion of the curfew and could have been renovated. However, along with many other similar buildings in the neighborhood, it had been declared unsound by the official inspectors and was thus razed to the ground. Walking through the empty, ghostly ruins of the neighborhood where he had grown up, Azad was pensive, looking sadly at the empty field, a place where he had many memories of both his grandfather's old home and the recently demolished family house. He said, "There is nothing left from my childhood. My childhood is gone." The two stories of Kalajik and Yüksekova, of two families dispossessed of their homes a century apart by state violence, and the stories of the material destruction of their houses demonstrates the layers of ruins and the repeating cycles of destruction imprinted on the landscape in southeastern Turkey. These two stories focus on two individual families, but they are echoed in the experiences of countless other individuals and families who were and continue to be caught up in the ongoing processes of dispossession and ruination. The past century of state violence in Turkey has been wrought upon bodies in visceral and physical ways through killing and massacre, torture and imprisonment, and forced migration and assimilation. These histories of violence demonstrate who in Turkey are considered bare life, unmournable bodies, ungrievable lives, or perhaps matter out of place within the nation. However, as I have demonstrated in this paper, these cycles of violence are not directed only against bodies deemed threatening, but against the material world that is an extension of those bodies, the spaces and places where they live and die, the material sites that they have built, and the objects that they leave behind. These spaces are erased and destroyed just as the histories are erased and silenced, and they are at times renovated or appropriated just as the histories are rewritten or revised. The stories of Kalajik and Yuksekova demonstrate that the processes of erasure do not only concentrate on the rewriting of the historical narrative or the eradication of people through genocide and demographic engineering, but that these processes are paralleled through the violent destruction of space, as has been demonstrated by scholars such as Gordillo, Stoller, and Wiseman. In this paper, and in my longer manuscript, I trace how the pasts and presents of Kurdish and Armenian communities are intimately intertwined through examining the palimpsests of violence that embody their overlapping histories of displacement, dispossession, and material destruction. Through exploring the complicated constellations of embodied social, material, and historical intercommunal interactions, I hope to push our understanding beyond accounts that focus on a single community in isolation from the multi-ethnic polities in which it existed. And additionally, I attempt to problematize binaries of victims and perpetrators by exploring the often contradictory everyday realities in which communities and individuals live. Historically, some Kurdish groups participated in massacres of Armenians and the appropriation of their property in 1915. Over the past century, Kurdish villagers have dismantled Armenian churches and cemeteries and used the stones to build their houses. But in the ensuing century, and most recently in the 1990s and during my fieldwork between 2015 and 2017, the Kurdish community in Turkey itself has been subject to forced migration, displacement, and expropriation on a massive scale. Kurdish groups were repositioned as enemies of the state, and the government and government forces burned and destroyed those same houses, creating new landscapes of ruins. Walter Benjamin approached the figure of the ruin as a dialectical image that exposes the historical contradictions of capitalism, the present, and the commodity form, and thus allows an exploration of alternative temporalities, inequalities in power, and myths of progress. In the case of Eastern Anatolia, Benjamin's work serves to elucidate the ways in which spaces of material ruin can disrupt mythical theories of history and teleological progress and expose the inherent historical contradictions embodied in the material form. Local Kurds in Van today interact with both the memory and the material remnants of the Armenian community through their own contemporary experiences of state violence and political negotiations vis-a-vis the state. The parallels and intersections produced by these repeating cycles of violence produce a space for critical disruption of official narratives of history that erase both Armenian and Kurdish experiences and obscure their fundamental interdependence. Thus, I suggest that ruins produced by state violence, in addition to facilitating a state-sponsored process of erasure and forgetting, also produce new spaces of memory, new understandings of the past, present, and future, and new possibilities for contesting processes of denial, assimilation, and the rewriting of history. Thank you so much for listening.
So thank you, Anoush, for your talk. We'll open it up for questions, and I think you can take your own questions.
Sure. Michael.
Thank you so much for a really thoughtful and kindly and sort of chilling talk as well. I really liked your framing about thinking about ruins as sites or social nodes where history and politics are rehearsed and rewritten. And so I was a little curious if you could talk more about how people interacted with some of these spaces, especially in Autodesk, I wanted to know, like, do local people who live there, talk about the historical houses of Van in a different way than the sort of placards on the site discuss it? Is there like a chance of not recuperating that history, but having multiple histories that are sort of more transient be produced there? And then the second question that's kind of related has to do with that giant rock in Anoush. Since Armenian tour groups are really like obsessed with it, as the site where Ara the Beautiful is supposedly attempted to be linked back to life by the Anoush spirits in pre-Christian times. So I'm wondering too, do these different kinds of ruins or different kinds of spaces produce different kinds of interactions? Is there a sense of that kind of weird, layered, or differently legible kinds of history in these different spaces?
Thank you so much for that question. Yeah, Anoush is a very rich site, which I would like to investigate more. As Michael sort of alluded to, it has a Armenian past way before this. So it's that rock. Apparently there was like Queen Semiramis was fighting with Ara the Beautiful back in sometime, I'm not sure when, mythological time. And she wanted to marry him because he was so beautiful, hence the name. But she also wanted to take over his kingdom, I think. And she instructed her soldiers not to kill him, but to take him alive as prisoner, and then they would get married and have a whole kingdom together. It would be great. But the soldiers accidentally killed him, and she was very upset. So she took his body to Araleskt, and it wasn't called that at the time, because that means licking Ara. They took him to that spot on top of the rock, and some mystical dog spirits, who supposedly could bring people back to life, licked him, supposedly to bring him back to life. It didn't work, I think. So she was disappointed. Did not work. But the village was called Araleskt, and has been called that until today, at least for Armenians. Araleskt, in some places, there were villages where Armenians lived there until 1915, and Kurds who were nearby moved in after the Armenians left. And in those cases, there are places in which Kurds tell stories about the Armenians who used to live there, or there's sort of a passing on of some kinds of memory. Or Kurds that I've talked to would say, my grandfather would say that Armenians would do this or that, or they would have a festival in their church at this time or in this day. Some rituals or stories were still passed on. But in Kalajik, this is not the case, interestingly, and actually Özge talked about this at the conference a couple weeks ago, because it's populated by a tribe of Kurds called Bruki, which is sort of an anomaly because they were from Yerevan and they left the Russian Empire and came and settled in formerly Armenian villages in the 1920s. And so they sort of came onto this kind of tabula rasa. Well, not really, but they came and they found all these empty villages and empty houses and they settled there. But they didn't have any contact with the people who had lived there before. And so in that case, I was looking for that. I would go hang out in Kalajik and ask around and see if people had any stories. It was kind of weirdly empty. I frequently went there and just hung out outside of that ruin and was like, is anyone going to show up who I can talk to? And a few people passed by. No one seemed to know anything about it, but they were younger. But I did have some friends who were from there. They were born and grew up there, and they had stories, at least from their childhood, about the rock. And there were sort of myths about the rock. Maybe I could go back to the rock so people can see the rock again. There's a large hole in the top of the rock, which seems to go, there we go, there's the rock. At the very top of the rock, there's a deep hole, kind of like a well, and people talk about that if you go down that well, there will be a tunnel that will go all the way to the Van Castle, which is some miles away. But both of these places were used during Urartian times, which is 3,000 years ago, so it's well before Armenian times. So in this case, there aren't too many of those kinds of passed on memories. Although in the terms of the cemetery, I also went and hung out in the cemetery just taking pictures. And on multiple occasions, people would come and ask me if I was looking for treasure. at one point, a man came and told me that what I was doing was illegal and that this was a protected historical site, a protected archaeological site, and I couldn't dig for treasure there. I told him that I wasn't digging for treasure, but he seemed unconvinced. And I later went and looked in the registries, and it's not a protected archaeological site. So I think he had some alternate motives. Like, I think he was looking for sort of someone to help him look for treasure. So there are definitely ideas and stories about these places. They're in the middle of the village, and in all of these places, the people who live around them may know something about it, or if they don't, the blanks are filled in with all kinds of stories. But thank you for your question.
This was really fascinating. I really liked everything about it, and I was looking forward for this talk for a while. My question is, I think you anticipated my question with the last part of your answer to Michael. How did you navigate these spaces as an American Armenian? What about how did you navigate in terms of your identity? How did you talk to people? How did you know when to say certain things to avoid harassment, or when to and then when did you feel like, okay, I'm in a comfortable or safe zone, and I can say whatever I want to, and ask questions, obviously with respect to ethics. And my second part of my question is, Van occupies a huge space in the Armenian collective memory, but I wonder what is the relation of the Bolsahais, the Istanbul Armenians, to Van? Because at least my interaction with Bolsahais was that they are not that keen on looking at connections into Anatolia. They are very much siloed in Istanbul, and they don't want to look out. I don't know if is it for safety reasons or is it for I was wondering if there were any Bolsahais, any pilgrimages coming from Bolis, Istanbul, to the region. But I'm really interested in terms of how did you navigate the space as a ethnographer, anthropologist. Did people? I mean, people knew that you were Armenian and you're from America, right? Yeah.
Thank you for that question. That's a great question. Something I thought about a lot while I was there. So for those who haven't picked up, I'm Armenian American. I was born here, but my family actually has roots in Van, which is not why I did my research there, but there was that connection. And my policy, so when I first went to Van to do research, it was summer of 2014, and I was doing preliminary research for 2 months and studying Kurdish, and the peace process was going on, and it was just like a festival atmosphere all the time. Everyone was speaking Kurdish outside, playing Kurdish music. They were selling rings and necklaces with the image of the imprisoned leader of the PKK on the street. It was sort of a free-for-all. And so I felt very comfortable at that time, telling people I was Armenian. People celebrated that. Everyone wanted to be friends with the new Armenian in town. It was kind of cool. Then when I came back in 2015 to do my 2 years of research, the war started 4 days after I arrived back in Turkey, and suddenly things shifted. It was no longer safe to be a dissident or to be openly oppositional. And many of the spaces that I had frequented the year before, Kurdish language associations, Kurdish cultural associations, were forcibly shut down, and a lot of people were arrested, or they were suspended from their jobs. And so suddenly everyone was on high alert, and I didn't feel comfortable anymore trotting around saying hi, I'm Armenian, how do you feel about that? And so instead I switched into extreme sort of self-preservation gear, and I would not tell people that. I would mostly say I'm American. I would not say I'm Armenian. I would say I'm a tourist, I'm not a researcher. I don't say that I speak Kurdish. I would say I'm just learning Turkish. I love your language, I love your food. I was sort of trying to depoliticize myself, because me being there as an Armenian, as an American, was already it was touchy. People thought, if they knew I was Armenian, which they would figure out eventually, they would think that I was either a treasure hunter or some kind of irredentist trying to retake my land. And if they didn't know that and they thought I was an American, a lot of people would think that I was a CIA spy. And so that was even sort of dangerous. So during the war, it was not a great time to be there, and I was often luckily, somehow, I avoided ever being arrested or interrogated by the police, which I'm still surprised by, because most of my colleagues who were there at the same time did get sort of in the crosshairs. I would not carry a notebook with me. I wouldn't take, notes by hand. I would do it all on the computer. But for people who I did feel comfortable opening up to, so there were spaces in which I felt comfortable, and it was usually with people who were either Kurdish and leftist or Turkish and leftist, and they were open about their political situation, that they would say, they would often open the conversation saying things that surprised me, often like, I would like to apologize on behalf of my ancestors for the genocide. I don't expect that from everybody, but okay, I can see where you're positioning yourself, so this is a safe space and we can talk about this. And in those cases, people like that were usually very curious, and they would ask me questions more than I would ask them questions. And so that's a partial answer to that. And then about Bolsahides, about Istanbul Armenia. So for those who don't know, in Turkey today, the Armenian community is mostly situated in Istanbul. There are about, numbers are kind of fuzzy, but maybe around 60,000 Istanbul Armenians. And outside of Istanbul, negligible numbers. Istanbul Armenians, I would agree with you, by and large, are not that interested in going to Anatolia, where many of their families came from. There's a little bit of looking down on the countryside, on the interior, on the periphery, and a lot of looking down on Kurds as being backwards, as being less than, and there's not much. I mean, there are some people who are interested and who go and travel, but on the whole, I got a lot of kind of sideways looks when I said I was going, and personal criticism as well by Istanbul Armenian friends who were like, why are you going there and hanging out with these Kurds? You should be here in Istanbul with us. One anecdote to illustrate that, in 2010, the Tamar, the church, had the first church service since it was restored. It was restored in 2007, 2010, they had the first church service. And there weren't enough hotels to accommodate all of the visitors. And so the next year, a Kurdish reporter from Van decided to start a project called, I think it was called like Evimiz Açıyoruz or something like that, like we open our houses. And they decided that local Kurdish families would open their houses to the Armenians coming from abroad, from Istanbul, from Armenia, and they would stay with them so that we could all be brothers and sisters again and look forward in a sort of better way than in the past. So they started this campaign. They got hundreds of people to sign up to open their houses to people coming from outside of Van. And then they had much fewer people come than they expected. So nobody actually ended up staying with Kurdish families, as far as I know. The hotels were sufficient. But I had some friends in Istanbul, an Istanbul Armenian woman and a Kurdish man, who wanted to make a documentary about this. So they had this idea. They got some money. They wanted to get an Armenian person with roots in Van, go to Van for the church service and stay with a Kurdish family. And they went around, they interviewed families. They interviewed like 10 or 20 families, and nobody wanted to do it. They were, Istanbul Armenians. And they all said, we'd like to go to the ceremony, we'd like to go to the church service, but we'd rather stay in a hotel. We don't want to stay with some Kurdish family that we don't know. So they had this money and they had this program to make this documentary, and they couldn't find anybody. So they called me and they said, you have roots in Van, right? Could you be our subject? Even though I'm not from Istanbul, the idea was, people from Istanbul and Van, but they couldn't find anyone who was willing to do this. And so I said, fine, so I, joined in, and I was the subject of their documentary and went and stayed with the Kurdish family. And that was one of the things that sort of got me interested in these questions in Van. But that sort of speaks to this disconnect.
Yeah.
Yes.
I came here with the prejudice that the people who were driving out the Armenians were seeking their property, their land and whatever. And I've been dissuaded from that by your talk, because certainly in the cities they were destroying everything, so they weren't after the property there. And if they were after the property on the land, I haven't seen in any of your slides evidence that the land was being farmed. So I don't even know how these people made a living, how the villages subsisted. But it seems to me that the effort, at least in the cities where they destroy not only the houses, but the cemeteries, that's really overreaching, that's really vindictive. That it's a deliberate effort to destroy the whole cultural and the culture and the reason for people to live there. So I wonder, how did people make a living in this country, and what aspirations could the people who came in to drive out the Turks, or drive out the Kurds and the Armenians, what could have been their motivation other than just to destroy their culture?
Thank you for your question. So let me go back a little bit. So I would, as you saw, I'm talking about two different temporal spaces, 1915 and 2015, and in both of these spaces where we have this destruction. So I think you're talking about both, if I'm not wrong. In 1915, I definitely am not trying to exculpate Kurds, Kurdish groups who participated in massacres. That is not my goal. Although I am trying to complicate the story, because in sort of, not in the historiography, because there is very rich historiography, especially recently, about the details of the Armenian genocide, but kind of in a narrative, a simplistic narrative that is around in the Armenian community. There's this idea that, we were victims, Turks and Kurds killed us, and end of story. They are sort of forever atemporal, ahistoric perpetrators, and we are ahistoric victims. This, what I'm trying to do is complicate that and show how, while there were Kurdish groups who were perpetrators in 1915, the Kurdish community as a whole was then turned into became victims throughout the last century and still today. Although in 1915, there were the Kurdish groups that did participate in massacres of Armenians, in many cases, were looking to take over property, and they did take over property. And people say this as well. The people that I talked to, my informants, they would say, we were tricked by the Ottoman government, by the Turks. We were told that if we killed our Armenian neighbors, we could have their houses, we could have their land, we could have their property, and we did that because we were ignorant. We took over we killed them, we took over their property, but now we're paying the price. Now we're cursed. And they did farm that land. I mean, there is, at that time, the Kurdish community in 1915 were mostly pastoralists and some agriculturalists, and still today there are, amongst the rural Kurdish community, there are a lot of farmers, there are a lot of people who practice animal husbandry. And so, yeah, I don't know if that answered your question. Maybe we can come back to it, but I see two questions. So Tuğçe and then Hakan.
Thank you so much, Anoush. This was a fascinating lecture. And one thing that through your talk that kept haunting me was this immaterial ruins that you mentioned at the beginning of your talk, with this physically non-existent church replaced by a mosque, but still people are aware of its existence. So it used to exist there, and apparently when you talk to people, they told you that the church was dismantled and replaced by a mosque. So my question is, because that was so interesting to me, so I wonder, in your larger project, where do you situate this physically non-existent ruins, but their actual space, the space they occupied, was marked somehow with this, usually with mosques. So where do you situate in your narrative of local memory and history in one? Not in this particular case, but maybe in your larger project. So if it makes sense.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tuğçe. That's a very interesting question, and that is the fate of a lot of these places, because there were some places like Tamar that were restored, and then there are a lot of places that are sort of partially ruined, but they're still visible, and so you can go to them and you can see them. But most places, or maybe half, were mostly destroyed, or you wouldn't walk around and know that something existed. And so the existence of these monasteries and churches and houses and cemeteries that were there are mostly, they live on in local stories and narratives around these places, and they continue to have some kind of like power or affective pull, or you might say like that they are enchanting the landscape in some ways, and it's different in different places. And so, for instance, one place, you may have all heard of Arshil Gorky. I think I've told this story in Michigan at other times. There was one church that was destroyed, and the local imam told the man who destroyed it not to destroy it because it is a sacred site. But he destroyed it anyway, and he built a house out of the stones. And then pretty immediately afterwards, apparently, he got sick and his children died and his wife died, and that house is now empty, and you can go and see the house, which is where the church used to stand, and it's cracked. The walls are cracked and it's empty, the windows are cracked. And the people in that village will tell that story. If you go and ask for the church, they'll point you to that house and they'll say that's where it used to be, but this is what happened. And it's pretty clear that it's a very if A then B situation. It's like he destroyed the church and thus he was destroyed. In other cases, it's not so clear. There isn't such a clear retribution. But in the case of Narek, for example, in 1950, I haven't found this. I'm hoping someone will write about this eventually, like a historian. Anyone out there wants to write about this? This wave of destruction in 1950, I've heard it only anecdotally. People will say, this was here until 1950, and then it was destroyed. In the case of Narek, the people there will tell the story that very specifically the local governor said, destroy these churches. And they know which ones were there until that time. And they're still, even though the church is not there anymore, the monastery is not there anymore, they're still treasure hunting around it. So there's like a mosque, and then people digging everywhere around it, because they know that it was there. And so the space of that church is still, people are drawn to it, they're looking for things in it, and there are still stories that are told about it. So that space is still marked. Thank you.
So hang on, people are digging around, who's digging around?
Kurds are digging around looking for treasure.
Okay.
around the monastery. Yeah, there were people who were telling me that when I went to go see it, they were convinced that I was, again, looking for treasure in that monastery. They said that they know that there is an underground labyrinth of tunnels full of gold under the monastery. They just can't figure out where the entrance is. So if I could help them, that would be great. So Hakan, you had your hand up.
Thank you very much, Anoush. I very much enjoyed this, and I appreciated the angle you took in the narration in going beyond the binaries of victim and victimizer. I think this is very much needed in looking at the history of the landscape of violence. I was intrigued by your comment about the way Kurds have been seeing themselves as the new victims, or Armenians being the forerunners of Kurdish, the predicament of the Kurdish question. And I wonder who is invested in this narrative, because it seems that it is when the state blames the Kurds or accuse them of being Armenian, that the state also is invested in that narrative, in the way the Kurdish and the Armenian questions are intertwined. So it is not only in the way the Kurds have been experiencing it. So I'm just wondering about your thoughts about that, because when I was doing field work, it was Armenians in Istanbul who were telling me that Kurds only now are realizing what has happened to us when the state, when the Turkish state is going after them in the war. But I wonder when did this narrative? I don't have an answer for it, but who's invested in it, and if we can trace that the intertwined questions. Of course, historically and realistically, they have been intertwined since since the genocide, and then we see it in the early Republican period. But that narrative of historiography, I think, is fascinating to trace. Thank you.
Thank you, Hakan. That is a great question. Something I tried to sort of like parse out in my dissertation, but it still has a lot of unanswered questions. And like you said, like where did these things start? Because it's definitely not, I mean, the whole point of me trying to say, hey everyone, look, these are intertwined, because they're not saying that often on the ground in some places. Now, if you go to Van or you go to Mardin or you talk to PKK sympathetic or like leftist Kurdish movement sympathetic Kurds, most of the people that I talk to, they are sympathetic of this narrative that that we are suffering like the Armenians did, and we have these sort of parallel histories, and we are brothers or sisters, we are siblings in our parallel experience of state violence, and the Turkish state is sort of the ahistorical forever enemy of both of us that is always oppressing us as these victim groups who have, and we must come together and recognize that people would often ask me, why don't Armenians realize that we are in the same boat? Why don't Armenians in Armenia or in Istanbul realize and sympathize with the Kurdish movement? Because can't they see that we are suffering in the same way? But like you said, this is also a recent and constructed discourse. This was not necessarily, I don't think, the dominant discourse in 1915 when Kurds were participating in the massacres and they were convinced by Ottoman authorities that as brothers in Islam we should kill the infidels and take their land or whatever. Of course, not everybody subscribed to that at that time either. But when I talk to people of more or less my generation, they will say, my parents and my grandparents wouldn't think this. My parents and my grandparents would probably think that Christians are others because they're infidels or they're not believers, and so we shouldn't be so sympathetic with them. Whereas now we realize, they would say, that in fact we have both suffered in the same ways and we need to recognize our solidarity. This is something that many people would say came out of the Kurdish movement or within itself, and it was then propagated to people in Kurdistan. And so you had one of my informants explain this to me. She said, back in the 50s or the 60s, people would just destroy Armenian churches because they thought that they were built by people who were other than them. They were Christians, so these places didn't matter. But then in the 80s and 90s, when the PKK started becoming stronger and the guerrillas were like going out to villages and educating people or sort of raising awareness in the causes that they thought were important, this was one of the things they would say. They would say, we were told that we should kill Armenians and steal their land because they're Christian, but this is wrong. And in fact, what happened to them was wrong, and we need to recognize that this was their land. So this was one way that this came, as far as I have learned. There's much more to talk about that, but yes, you had a question?
Should I first?
Yeah.
First of all, I must say this. I know this is like keeping aside emotions, feelings, everything this kind of research evokes in a person who is coming from that geography. I should just say this is like such a smart scholarship, so I really appreciate, I just must say that. The way your literature, your references to Weizmann and Stroller, and the fact that palimpsest is not a metaphor in this case, but the literal object of memory, especially in the way you yourself as a researcher positioning by, for instance, following that home becoming a photograph, traveling to Detroit, and then you're finding that photograph, and then that photograph is becoming a painting, and then painting is becoming another photograph that you yourself are taking. So on the visual plane, actually palimpsest is super like genuinely astutely working in the way you want it to work, so that we can understand the narrative. My question, maybe this is not a very well structured question, but I'm really curious. I'm looking forward to reading this book, because based on the other talk you gave last year about treasure hunting, I'm just constantly in my mind like thinking about, I know you're an anthropologist, and anthropologists, as far as I learned so far, don't like meta-narratives. You're like digging deep into the layers and unearthing something from particular and like against, like politically against making a meta-narrative out of this. But because this geography is just such a like intensely upsetting place where I am as a person who is still seeking for some meta-narratives or like big frames. When I'm thinking of your like alternative temporalities thing, I'm curious how you're gonna structure the book, because alternative temporalities, in the way you are telling individual stories and wanting us to follow them, is not, I think, quite like legible to the reader, because there's also alternative spatialities, spaces that you want to articulate. Because in this way, I think as a reader, I'm left with the question of alternating temporalities, like Melanie mentioned earlier. When will this landscape give up revealing these stories of alternating violence, alternating bodies buried in the layers of earth? So rather than that, I'm curious whether maybe you're gonna already structure that way, because I really appreciate you're such a smart person. So my imagination is, of course, this shouldn't be said this way. Sorry, but I like complimenting this way. The way I was imagining as an architect, like each chapter is like archetypes: home, land, cemetery, village, so that you can articulate scales. And also Michael's, I think he left question regarding how these people, because that question, I think, a little bit dissolved into something, I don't know, the question how people or animals connect to these ruins right now is an important question, and property question. This kind of a very legit, but at the same time obvious to you sort of question will come up. How these people think of house, home. It's very important to, for instance, combine stories of Dilek and what was the husband. They're like newly constructed, aspiring to be a middle class apartment in the West sort of home. How does that overlap with the other home, which was built out of gold, actually gold translating into home, and then becoming rubble, and then traveling to Detroit, becoming another home in Detroit, which is part of that landscape ruination, if we can stretch the narrative to the United States. So scales, I think, matters, because when you jump from one to Yüksekova to Cizre to Istanbul, I think how those spaces connect to one another spatially could be maybe articulated via archetypes, in the sense that spatial archetypes that architects understand. I don't know, that could maybe allow to make a meta-narrative about alternative temporalities rather than alternating temporalities, so that we can be left with the question of, sorry, the language, fuck this, not just like violence is happening, but positionality as a researcher, I think, will be more open, in the sense that not as an American Armenian, your positionality. I don't think I'm curious about that as a scholar. Personally, I can talk to you about that. As a scholar researcher, what is your position in terms of which question you want us to be left with in the end? Sorry, too long.
No, that's great. That is a great question. I would love to talk to you about all the rest of the book. Yeah, no, that is a great question. Are we running out of time?
We have there was a. Do you want to respond, or do you guys want to take this up probably?
No, why don't you respond?
Or should I take? There were a few other questions too.
We will
Should
speak
I?
afterwards. Yeah.
Oh, that's true.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I think that is a wonderful question, and I totally take your critique that it is, what I'm talking about today is more alternating temporalities rather than alternative temporalities. And this is something I'm still trying to grapple with, because while I was in the field, people would often talk about, what was happening then is happening now, or what is happening now would happen then. We already saw this before. And so it was kind of like both, it seemed like cyclical. So instead of, thinking about, I was trying to think through Benjamin. So Benjamin is critiquing this linear progress, this linear teleological progress that there was then and now there's now, and there was, the past and now there's the better present, and then we will continue to form newer things and better things, and it will just keep continuing, and progress and modernity will go up. And he's saying, no, this is like a cycle of destruction, and looking at the ruin of modernity and capitalism, we can see within it its own contradictions. So I was trying to look at these ruins and think, like, okay, well, what is this critiquing? And one obvious critique, which is not something that anybody here, I hope, subscribes to, is like Turkish nationalist ideology of there was the Ottoman Empire and it was bad, and it was Islam, and it was backwards, and then Ataturk came and made everything great, and now we have modernity, and it's just, we're continuing up, and we're all Turks, and everything is wonderful. So this, obviously, looking at these ruins on the landscape, it critiques that kind of teleology. There's that kind of like modernist, nationalist teleology. And it shows how, in fact, there are many things that narrative elides or silences, which are these episodes of violence on which that republic was built, the Armenian genocide, and then the continuing violence, these cycles of violence that continue to have to happen in order to keep that myth going, that, we're not all Turks. There are these Kurds that are like continue to cause trouble, and they're not going away. And so still today, literally now, this is happening, in which Kurdish communities are they're trying to like cleanse them from the earth. So that's one part. But then the other part of the temporalities that I'm trying to think through is how Kurds on the ground talk about these things in terms of either all the same or cycling. So what's happening when I was first there in 2014, and the ISIS attacks on Yazidis in Sinjar was happening, and Shengal, they were saying, we're seeing what's happening to Yazidis now. It's just like what happened in 1915. We saw this happen to Armenians in 1915. It's happening again. So they were conflating or collapsing these things. Obviously not saying it's exactly the same, but in some ways saying it's exactly the same, that it's this cycle of time. And so they're, in a way, it's thinking about time not as, from past to present, but it's cycles of violence that are continuing to happen, which I worry about also saying that, because I don't want to just flatten everything and saying it's all the same, because they also don't see it that way, and they're continually fighting against it. So within that, I also see sort of a seed for some kind of critique. In this case, it's not just critique, it's like literal revolution. They're like actually people are on the ground in the mountains fighting a guerrilla war with these ideas. This is also, the things that I'm saying are not just like a few intellectuals talking about these things. They're like the people who are espousing, who are within the Kurdish movement are also talking with these ideas, which are mobilizing and motivating that actual fight against the occupation of like southeastern Turkey, Kurdistan, and so those ideas of this continual violence also engenders some kind of response, and but this is definitely not a perfect formulation. So I would love to talk more about that. Yeah, do I have time for more?
I could just pick up on, because I think my question was much better articulated by Seçil, but I wasn't going to focus on the archetype, but I like that idea very much. Mine was sort of picking up on Tuğçe's question on materiality, and I wouldn't say materiality, but discursive sort of, and what I see from what you're saying, there is a certain kind of cosmology that is being created, right? So that with these archetypes of home and land, that there's also trying to make sense of what's happening. And I think I may have mentioned this to you before when you gave your workshop paper, but there is the Armenian prophecy. There is a sign of a prophetic, right, of what is happening now with the with the Kurds. There is a Salvic approach to it too, because there's something about retribution, about sort of guilt, about curse, right? So that is also coming from the land, right? It's coming from a way of understanding, making sense of, like an ontology in a way, right? And so I think that's something that maybe you can also link the spiritual, the cosmic, with the very material as a meta-narrative.
Yeah. Can I take one more and then we can either respond or
I just
take it
wanted
later?
to make 2 points with respect to violence on the one side and the significance of the similarities between the Armenians and Kurds on the other one. I mean, with respect to what happened to the Armenians and Kurds, if you look at it from the vantage point of the state, these are both violences that are denied. So there is the denial aspect of it, I think, which is very crucial, especially in terms of the effect it has. Because one thing that at least I saw when I was talking about the past was that people have a very different orientation to it if their suffering is not acknowledged, because that, I think, in a way collapses time, the affect, the emotions, and the denial sort of collapses time, so that because you haven't been able to mourn. If when you mourn, you usually distance yourself from the violence. That is when you start healing. But if you do not do that, the violence is with you always, and there is no temporality in the sort of linear sense we're thinking about it. And it stays with the people. I mean, when I talk to Armenians today, the way they talk about 1915, you think it happened yesterday or a week ago, you know, not like all the time ago, 100 years ago, right? I mean, so I think, the same with the Kurds is that in their case, it's happened so frequently, they sort of have lost count of it. And of course, none of it is acknowledged either by the Turkish state, which also makes it, I think, very different. So maybe, I mean, you can change your conception of how you're approaching violence, because this is a very unique case when you have the palimpsests. The level, I mean, there is also a sort of affective layering, which becomes, I think, very important in that context.
Yeah. Should I respond or should I respond later?
You can respond and then we'll call it a day.
Okay. Thank you both so much. I didn't respond because I thought we were ending, but those are both very great points. You had mentioned to me before the issue of the idea of the salvation, the salvic point, and retribution and curses, that these are all linked together and that they're coming from the land is also a very interesting idea, so I'm going to build that in. And like you said, one of the major points is that these two groups, the violence against them is denied, and so in that way they're unrecognized, and they are still seeking retribution, recognition, and so that also that creates an impetus and a necessity in order to find that. That is a good point, which is why many Kurds continue to say to me, why don't the Armenians realize that we should have this solidarity? Can you go tell them that we should, like, you know? I'm like, I'm trying. So yeah, thank you both so much. I will continue that conversation.
Thank you.